Welcome to Retech. Today we're going to talk about a Commodore 64, but not any Commodore 64. We're going to talk about the Commodore 64G. It kind of gets overlooked a little bit in the whole kind of scheme of things, where as far as Commodore models are concerned, and it still needs to be kind of explained and documented because it's a place in Commodore's history, and it's still a place in the 8-bit micro history as well. Now, before we make a start doing that, Marcus wanted to do a little bit of programming, and he decided he wanted to do it on this particular model. So I'm just going to give you his thoughts on the machine before we go in depth, and I give you my thoughts on the machine itself. So I hope you enjoy this about the Commodore 64G, so let's have a look.
So I want to learn more about classic computers, but not games. I want to do programming. Programming is like a sort of thing that can help you learn more about computers than games. Games are just like an entertaining thing. They don't help you with anything. They just like entertain you. That's all they do. And I haven't done a program for a very long time, so I suggested that we could do a program today, and we could do a review on the Commodore 64G. So a Commodore 64G is basically a Commodore 64, but it's made for the German people. So the Commodore 64G is like a really pale colour, and the Commodore 64, the original one, is like a brownish, and the keys are really dark brown. These right here are a little, I might say, grey, and this whole thing right here, this is nothing like I've seen before. The keys are the same colour as the case. I've never seen something like that. And so the Commodore 64 original, these don't have symbols on top, but these do. If you can see, there's symbols. If you cover up the letter or the number, look, there's symbols underneath. They're called graphics symbols. Yeah, and on here there's no graphic symbols. Like it's just all brown. There's no graphic symbols like this one. They're on the front of the keys on the Commodore 64. So the power on here right now, if it's green, that means the power's on. If it's red, as you can see, the power's off right now. The power's on this one right now is because it's not plugged in. Yeah, so the motherboard in this computer is based on the Commodore 64C. And the sound chips is way more different than the original one. On the Commodore 64 original, they think there's like this bubbling sound that you don't get on these Commodore 64Gs. On the Commodore 64 original, the sound chip is like all bubbly. You do not get that on any other computer. What I mean by bubbling is when the volume goes up, there's like a pop, and down there's a pop, which there isn't on this one right here. The really pale one, it does not do that. It's just normal. And some say the original sound is better. That's because it plays speech samples better than the 64G, but there is a fix. Other than that, they're both very similar machines. So this one right here, the Commodore 64G right here, I like it better of the colour, because it's like way more lighter and I like light colours. So I want to do some programming on the Commodore 64G. So let's see how it goes.
Right, so those are the thoughts of Marcus, and they're not wide of the mark, but I'm going to basically have a look at it now and do a little bit more in depth on it while he does his programming on it. And so it's quite nice for somebody of his age to want to program and not do games. So we'll have a look at it towards the end of this episode to what he's been doing. But on with the 64G. Now, the 64G was Commodore's answer to a question that really shouldn't have existed, because Commodore had already brought out the Commodore 64C. And I think most people will recognise this as the Commodore 64C. It was Commodore's revision of the original Commodore 64, or the bread bin as people call it, and some people in the States call it the bread box. And this was brought out to kind of update the machine, make it look a little bit more mid-1980s instead of early 1980s. And it's a nice looking machine. It's very, very wedge shape, and it uses the same shape and style as what Commodore were going to be using for their LCD machine. So it's kind of roughly around the same era of when they were developing their LCD machine or their portable machine, and you can see the design influence. But although this was a nice machine and it made much more sense than the machine behind, that style, not the 64G but the style of machine, because it was a lot more profiled, so you could actually do a lot more typing and have your wrists in a much more natural position instead of kind of hovering them quite high on the keyboard. And it made a lot of sense. Now, you may be wondering why they brought out a 64G when the 64C was a much more modern machine in appearance, and it had a little bit more modern architecture under the hood. So you might be wondering, why did they kind of do a step back to the style of the original bread bin but in slightly different colours and call it the 64G? Well, that was mainly for the German market, and as Marcus pointed out, it's kind of a throwback really for this, the Commodore Music Maker keyboard, because the actual keyboard part here would not fit the Commodore 64C. And that's the biggest reason why this was very, very popular in Germany, and they never made a version for the 64C, or Commodore didn't make a version for the 64C. So the logical conclusion was, well, if it's such a popular system and it's such a popular add-on in Germany, then we'll do a version of the 64 for Germany. Now that kind of makes sense, because you don't want to alienate a large chunk of your client base, because at the end of the day Commodore was not making as much money as it used to. The price of the machine had dropped dramatically, and they weren't making massive amounts of money. They were still making, on kind of average, twice what the manufacturing costs were for this machine, so they're still making a profit. So it kind of makes sense to reuse some of the old molds and some of the original keyboards and so on to make a version specifically for quite a large market, which was Germany. Now, it was only ever really released in Germany, although you could eventually find it in other countries, which is, you know, how most people got hold of them. And there was a nickname for this machine, and it was the Aldi, Commodore 64 Aldi, or Commodore Aldi. That's because it was sold in the basically discount shops. Now, the 64G, which we have here, was quite a cost-reduced model. It used very thin plastics, and it kind of the keyboards were mix and match. Now, on this model, you've got a cream case with a slightly off beige keyboard, and that was one of the kind of combinations this machine could have been purchased in. The other one was an original style Commodore 64 keyboard, which was much darker but in a very similar case. And there were also different shades of cream or white, as you might look at it. One was slightly brighter, more white, and the other one was similar to this, a little bit more on the cream side, which almost matched the 64C, but you know, it was kind of probably a shade darker. But you know, Commodore had a habit of producing the same machine with different size cases, different colours of keyboards, different colours of casing, but also still selling it as exactly the same model. So you actually find 2 or 3 different Commodore 64s are all shaded slightly differently. The keys are slightly different and so on. But you know, that's the way it was back then, because Commodore were actually using up parts from their parts bin. Really, they probably had quite a supply of keyboards from various slight colour differences and so on through the years, and they were just using them up because at the time Commodore were a little bit strapped for cash, and it made sense to try and get these machines out of the door and make a little bit of money. Now, the machine itself is just a Commodore 64. It uses the more modern motherboard, the smaller motherboard, with, a lot of people say, the worst version of the SID chip. But the new SID chip, based on the 8500 or the 8580, was basically what the original designer intended it to be. Now, the original designer was Robert Yanis, and he designed the original 6581, and it was meant to be a much more sophisticated chip than the actual version that ended up inside the Commodore 64. He's kind of stated that it was meant to have up to 12 voices, which the 64 version didn't. It had 3 plus noise. So it was almost a cut down version of his original plan, but it was still so far ahead of just about every other machine out there in terms of sound that, you know, the fact that it didn't have 12 voices really didn't make any difference, because it was such a fantastically well designed chip. But, and here's the big but, the chip itself wasn't finished. It wasn't completed in the way that Mr. Yanis really wanted it to be. It still had issues. It had issues on its volume. So if you increased volume, you'd hear a pop, and a lot of basically software writers would take advantage of that so they could get in speech synthesis, etc. So that's how they managed to put in speech samples, etc. into games for the Commodore 64. Now, it was a flaw, and the chip was basically kind of hobbled, is probably not the right term for it, but the chip wasn't what was intended, not wholly anyway. So what happened is, writers for software and sound got used to the limitations of the chip, and then they used it to their advantage to make the SID chip fly, basically, to make it do what they wanted it to do. Now, When the later SID came out in the 64C and the G, it was a much lower power chip. It didn't need 12 volts. It could run on happily on 9 volts. It ran cooler. It should have been, and probably is, a more reliable chip, because some of the older SID chips are failing. They're failing in big numbers, and it's getting harder and harder to get hold of an original SID chip. And that meant that some of the more unscrupulous people were selling so-called brand new SID chips or new old stock SID chips, which weren't really. They were faulty chips. And some other countries such as China got in on that act as well, which kind of is a bit disappointing if you're waiting for a new SID chip for your machine and you find out it's not really what you ordered. But that's a bit of an aside, because the more modern version doesn't have those issues. It seems to be more reliable, but what they did with it, apart from it running cooler and lower voltage, they cleaned up the sound. They cleaned up the AND gate on the chip as well, so you didn't get that popping. It was a lot cleaner in its waveforms. It was basically what the designer really wanted for this chip when it first appeared. So again, some people say that the sound is worse, some people say that the sound is better. It's kind of down to opinion, but the frequencies are going to be the same, but they're cleaner on the newer chip. You don't get the dirty sound that the original SID chip has, and you also don't get the volume pop as well. So samples can be very, very quiet on the 64C and the 64G, but then again there's a software fix for it, so it's kind of something that was able to be fixed within the life of the machines anyway. So it's a matter of opinion as to which one sounds the same. Now, other than that, the machines are pretty much identical in function to the original Commodore 64. But as I said, the motherboard is cost reduced, the motherboard has a different SID chip, and the motherboard has less components, which again should aid reliability. But it's kind of horses for courses. If you didn't know the 64 or the original 64 existed and you had one of these, you'd be perfectly happy with it. Or if you had a 64C, you'd be perfectly happy with it. And again, we're kind of comparing things after the fact, whereas comparing like for like at the time, most people wouldn't have known any difference, because not a lot of people had two Commodore 64s at home. So comparing them now to comparing them then is a little bit of a moot point. But we're going to take a quick look at this Commodore 64G, and we're going to see if there are any other differences on the machine. Okay, so this is the 64G, G standing for Germany, and as you can see, it virtually uses the Commodore 64C's keyboard and the keyboard printing method, with all of the PET ASCII symbols printed on the tops of the keys instead of on the front. And you might think this is actually a 64C keyboard, but it's not. It's completely different in colour, and you can actually hear the difference in quality. They use a very different mechanism on the keys. It's principally the same, but it's kind of what they've done is reduced the cost on the actual components themselves, and it's very similar to what the Commodore 16 used, okay, and it's got a very similar feel about it, including a very flexible case. And that's one thing you can not really say about the 64C, because it seems to have quite a quality case about it, which is pretty sturdy. The other thing is it's got a green LED instead of red, and it has a very different badge on the top. But for all kind of intents and purposes, it's just a Commodore 64. This model has been modified for Jiffy DOS, which, as you can see, it's installed, which is very easily reverted back by holding down the restore key, and you get back to the original Commodore 64 system without Jiffy DOS. But that's an aftermarket installation. And the other thing I can really kind of point out is that the actual picture, this is using RF, and it's quite a clean picture as well. There's a lot less kind of banding on the screen, and it seems to be a little bit clearer, or a little bit more clearer when compared to the original 64. It is basically a Commodore 64C in what really is the Emperor's old clothes. Is it worth having one of these machines? Because if you got an original Commodore 64 and you've also got a 64C, then why would you actually need a 64G? Well, you don't. You don't need a 64G at all. So if you've got an original Commodore 64, you don't really need a 64C either, because functionally they're all very much the same, and they'll run very much the same software, and they'll do very much the same thing, and they'll play very much the same games, and they'll run all of the same disk drives, etc. So there's not really a massive need to have these models unless you just want to collect them. But personally, I think this is one of the nicer looking bread bin style models. I like the cream and beige, and it, you know, I like the way it's put together, and I like the style of it, and I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons why you want to go out and purchase one of these. But overall, I'm guessing if you have either a bread bin 64 or an original 64C, you know, this isn't really a machine you'd want to go out and kind of find unless you want to do it for collector's sake. I personally like the style of this over the bread bin because I'm never massively keen on the kind of light greyish or brown models, because I don't know, it's just me, I prefer lighter colours on things anyway, which is my own preference. A lot of people don't, but you know, I do feel that, you know, this machine was given a bit of a rough ride because people saw this as a low-end kind of games machine because it was priced very cheaply. It was now an entry-level PC or an entry-level computer instead of a kind of top-of-the-range computer, which is what the Commodore 64 really started out as. Now, the price wars with Jack Tramiel and everybody else on the planet kind of devalued all of the Commodore machines, and it also devalued a lot of the other manufacturers' machines because they were struggling to meet the ever lower price points, and that meant quality went out of the window. And you can tell by the quality of the keys, the plastics and so on, but that was a sign of the times, and that was the way all manufacturers were going, because computers were now, as Jack Tramiel actually rightly said at the time, are for the masses, and the only way to get computers in the hands of the masses was to make them cheap enough for them to impulse buy them. And that's where this machine really shone, because in Germany it was an impulse buy, and it got a good foothold, and it lasted a lot longer than any other 8-bit micro that was out there at the time. This is your Commodore 64G. So, I hope you enjoyed that quick look into the Commodore 64G. And I hope you found it interesting. And if you're thinking of adding to your Commodore collection, well, this is probably one to have a look at, especially, you know, in these colours, which I quite like. But there's also the Commodore VC20, which was also a German engineered machine, because Vic sounded like a German swear word, so they changed it to VC. So there are marked differences in the Commodore range of computers at the time, even within the same models, and it's, you know, it's nice to have a bit of history. And the 64G kind of gets missed out because it's seen as just another bread bin Commodore 64. One of the kind of strange things about the 64G as well is that the 64GS, which was a flop Commodore's gaming system, was kind of recycled. The boards were recycled, and a lot of the components were recycled to make some of the Commodore 64Gs. And you know, basically you may find that if you open up one of these, you have a GS system board in, or a system board that was going to be installed in a GS. And that was before they decided that it wasn't worth selling them anymore. So if you have a Commodore 64G or a Commodore Aldi machine, as it was nicknamed, and you find that the keyboards are different, well, they probably are. It hasn't been changed. They did mix and match components on these just to get them out the door and to get rid of components they had in stock. So I hope you enjoyed this brief kind of interlude or brief look into the Commodore 64G, and hope meet each other on the channel in the future. So thanks for your time, and we'll finish off with Marcus and some of his programming, and then we'll say goodbye. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and hope to see you soon. And don't forget, if you like what you see, please subscribe. Thank you.
So right now I'm going to start doing your role, and then I'm going to go to the next page and do random graphics. Bye, see you later. I'm going to be here for an hour. Bye. I've done a dice rolling program, and let's see if it works. Care to try your luck? Red dice equals 6, white dice equals 7. Press spacebar to roll another.
Picking a random number, isn't it? Okay, so where's the random bit on that program?
RND.
Yes, there you go. Okay, so you're randomizing times 6 plus 1, so you're randomizing basically between 6
Equals 7.
and 7, yes. So if you added times 10, it would pick up a random number between
10 and 0.
Yeah, okay. So, and it's the same, okay, and it's for the white dice, it's exactly the same. Can you see that? So it's randomizing a number that you've set between 1 and 8.
So this is an 8-bit guide favourite, and this is it's random graphics, and it's straight from the manual. So I'm going to now type run, R-U-N, turn, and it doesn't mix. That means I did it first try. This is another use of a random statement. Instead of generating dice, it's generating graphics. And it's all because of this book right here.